I should say before I tell you this story properly that there are two letters people confuse when they talk about how this all began, and I was not part of the first one. That letter, the one Leo Szilard drafted and Albert Einstein signed back in August of 1939, warning President Roosevelt that Germany might be pursuing a uranium weapon, I had no hand in at all. I was in Berkeley at the time, teaching, doing the kind of theoretical physics I'd built my whole career around, and I read about that letter's consequences the way most physicists in this country eventually did, secondhand, through the slow bureaucratic churn it set in motion. The letter I want to tell you about is a different one. It came to me nearly 3 years later in the fall of 1942, and it was the one that actually pulled me personally into the center of everything that became the Manhattan Project. And I want to be honest with you about something most retellings of my life leave out entirely. When that letter arrived asking me to take on a role I hadn't sought, hadn't campaigned for, and in some ways wasn't obviously qualified to hold, I came very close to writing back and saying no. To understand why, you have to understand where I stood professionally in 1942, and how strange it would have seemed to almost anyone who knew me that I'd end up running the central laboratory of the largest scientific undertaking in human history. I was a theorist. That distinction mattered enormously in physics at the time, more than people outside the field often appreciate. Theoretical physicists worked with mathematics, with pencil and paper, with ideas about the structure of stars and the behavior of subatomic particles. Experimentalists worked with machines, with hardware, with the day-to-day discipline of building apparatus that actually functioned in a laboratory. I had never run anything resembling a large technical operation. I had never managed a budget larger than the university departments. My administrative experience by 1942 consisted almost entirely of organizing seminars and supervising graduate students, which is a very different kind of work from what I was about to be asked to do. There were also, and I won't pretend otherwise, real questions swirling around my background that made my selection on paper a genuinely surprising choice. I had, in the 1930s, been close to a number of people involved in left-wing political causes. My brother Frank, my former fiancé Jean Tatlock, my wife Kitty's first husband had been a Communist Party member who died in the Spanish Civil War. I had donated money to causes connected to the Spanish Republican effort. None of this made me a security risk in any meaningful sense, but it made me, in the eyes of the military intelligence apparatus that would eventually have to approve my clearance, exactly the kind of figure a cautious security officer would flag immediately, and several of them did repeatedly throughout the war. General Leslie Groves, an Army engineer who had just been placed in charge of the entire Manhattan Project that September, was the man whose letter, whose direct proposal, ultimately reached me. I'd met Groves briefly before that point, through my involvement in some of the early theoretical work on fast neutron reactions being coordinated out of various university laboratories. He was blunt and patient with academic hedging, and famous already, even in those early weeks of his command, for making decisions quickly and expecting the people around him to keep pace. What Groves needed by October of 1942 was someone to organize and direct a new centralized laboratory, one that would bring together the scattered theoretical and experimental work happening at Berkeley, Chicago, Columbia, and elsewhere, and consolidate it into a single site dedicated entirely to designing an actual deliverable weapon. Until that point, the project had been a patchwork of separate university efforts, each working somewhat independently on different pieces of the underlying physics. Groves understood correctly that this arrangement could never move fast enough to produce a working weapon in time to matter for the war. He needed one place, one laboratory, with one person responsible for pulling everyone's work together into something that could actually be built, tested, and used. When his proposal reached me through a series of conversations that fall, culminating in a formal, direct offer he communicated in writing, I remember reading it and feeling something closer to alarm than excitement. I understood immediately what he was asking, and I understood with the same immediacy how many reasons there were to say no. I had no experience directing anything at this scale. I would be asking some of the most accomplished experimental physicists in the country, men considerably more senior than me, men like Robert Bacher, or later at the laboratory, figures like Kenneth Bainbridge, to accept my authority over a project that would determine the outcome of a war. Several of the physicists I most wanted to recruit had informally expressed skepticism about whether a theorist with no administrative background could actually run a laboratory of the size and complexity this project would require. I shared some of that skepticism myself, if I'm honest about it now. It wasn't false modesty. I genuinely didn't know if I could do what Groves was asking. There was also the security problem, and it was not a minor one. I knew my own file would raise concerns because I understood exactly what was in it. Even before the Army's investigators finished compiling it formally, I remember specifically weighing whether it made any sense to accept a position this significant, knowing that my own background might become, at some point down the road, a liability to the very project I'd be leading. A distraction at best, a genuine security crisis at worst. Taking the job meant accepting that scrutiny permanently for as long as the project lasted, and likely long after. And there was a more personal hesitation sitting underneath all of this, one I've thought about more in the years since than I let myself dwell on at the time. Accepting this role meant, in a very real sense, giving up the kind of physics I had spent my career doing. I would not be solving equations about the interior structure of collapsing stars, or working through the mathematics of electron behavior, the kind of pure theoretical work that had defined my professional identity up to that point. I would be an administrator, a director, someone managing personnel disputes, supply chains, security clearances, construction schedules for buildings in a remote part of New Mexico. I had at that point only visited briefly, years earlier. As a young man recovering from illness on a ranch not far from where the laboratory would eventually be built, I drafted more than one letter back to Groves that fall, trying to work out on paper whether I could honestly accept what he was proposing. I don't have those early drafts anymore. I'm not sure they survived the years or my own later carelessness with personal papers, but I remember the substance of what I was wrestling with in them. I laid out plainly the case against myself. I told him, in essence, that I understood the position required someone with real administrative experience, someone the senior experimentalists would respect immediately on the basis of a proven track record running large technical operations, and that I wasn't confident I was that person. What ultimately changed my mind wasn't a single conversation or a single argument that resolved every doubt at once. It was a slower recognition over the weeks that followed of something Groves himself seemed to understand better than I did at the time. And something I came to believe was true once I stopped focusing exclusively on my own inexperience and started thinking instead about what the project actually needed. The theoretical work, the physics itself, the actual science of how a weapon like this would need to be designed was, by late 1942, more advanced in my own head and in the collective understanding of the small group of theorists I'd already been coordinating informally than almost anywhere else in the country. I had spent much of the previous year running exactly the kind of informal theoretical seminar that would eventually need to become the intellectual core of whatever laboratory got built. I understood, better than most administrators, who might otherwise have chosen, exactly what scientific problems the laboratory would need to solve first, which ones could wait, and which physicists specifically had the right combination of talent and temperament to solve them. Administrative experience could in principle be learned on the job, with the right people around me to handle logistics I didn't understand. A genuine grasp of the underlying physics and the judgment to know which problems mattered most was harder to substitute for. Groves, for his part, made an argument to me directly that I've never forgotten because it cut through most of my hesitation in a way I hadn't expected from a military engineer with no patience for academic uncertainty. He told me, essentially, that he didn't need someone who already knew how to run a laboratory of this size, because no one alive had ever run a laboratory quite like the one this needed to become. What he needed was someone who understood the actual scientific problem well enough to make fast, correct judgments about where to direct the laboratory's limited time and resources, and who had the standing among the physicists whose cooperation the project depended on to be taken seriously despite his relative youth and lack of formal authority. He believed I had both of those things, even if I didn't yet have the administrative experience that would normally accompany a role like this. And he made clear, in the plainest possible terms, that the alternative to me accepting wasn't some more qualified candidate waiting in the wings. It was continued delay, continued fragmentation of the effort across separate university sites at a moment when every month mattered enormously, given what we believed, correctly or not, we didn't fully know at the time, about how far along German physicists might already be on the same problem. That argument about time was, in the end, the piece that mattered most to me. Whatever doubts I had about my own qualifications, I didn't have any real doubt about the underlying urgency. I believed, in the fall of 1942, that Germany had a meaningful head start on this problem, built on a scientific tradition in nuclear physics that had, until Hitler's rise, been the strongest in the world. Physicists I respected enormously, men who had trained in Germany, who understood exactly how capable the physicists still working there were, shared that concern. If there was even a real possibility that German scientists were further along than we were, then every month spent organizing separate university efforts instead of one consolidated laboratory was a month that possibility had to close that gap further. I signed the formal agreement to direct the laboratory in early 1943, after Groves had worked through the security concerns with his own intelligence officers. A process that involved considerably more scrutiny of my background than I'd initially anticipated, and that in some ways never fully resolved, following me in various forms for years afterward, culminating eventually in the hearing that stripped my security clearance in 1954. But in that earlier moment, in the winter of 1942 into 1943, Groves made the judgment that whatever risk my background represented, it was outweighed by what he believed I could contribute to the project's success, and he was willing to put his own authority behind that judgment. I've thought many times since about what would have happened if I'd sent one of those earlier drafts instead, if I'd told Groves honestly that I didn't believe I was the right person, and let him find someone else. I don't know who that would have been. There were other physicists with more administrative experience, men who might have run a laboratory more smoothly, with fewer of the interpersonal tensions that inevitably arose from a young theorist suddenly directing physicists considerably senior to him in age and experimental reputation. Whether any of them could have built the same intellectual cohesion among that particular group of scientists, drawn from dozens of different institutions and disciplines, brought together in an isolated location most of them had never seen before accepting the job, I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that the hesitation I felt that fall wasn't false humility, and it wasn't a performance I later exaggerated for effect the way some retellings of this period sometimes suggest. It was a real, substantial doubt about whether I was the right choice for a role that would determine, in ways none of us could fully appreciate at the time, an enormous amount about how the war ended and what the world looked like afterward. I weighed that doubt seriously for weeks before deciding that the argument about urgency and about the specific alignment between my own understanding of the physics and what the laboratory would actually need in its earliest, most critical months outweighed everything I didn't yet know how to do. I think about that decision differently now than I did at the time, with the distance of everything that came afterward: Trinity, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the hearings, the years of scrutiny that followed. I don't know that a younger version of myself, reading this from where I sit now, would have made the same choice again, knowing everything that followed from it. But I understand, more clearly now than I did in 1942, why the hesitation itself mattered. It wasn't an obstacle standing between me and an obvious, inevitable decision. It was the honest recognition that I was being asked to become responsible for something whose full weight I couldn't yet measure, and that recognizing my own uncertainty, rather than dismissing it, was probably the only honest way to walk into a role like that at all. I signed the letter, eventually, because I came to believe the project needed someone who understood the physics deeply enough to make good decisions quickly, more than it needed someone who already knew how to run a laboratory. Whether that was the right calculation, history has judged in more ways than one, and I don't think that judgment has fully settled even now. But I know it wasn't a decision I made lightly or quickly or with the kind of confidence people sometimes assume must have accompanied a choice this consequential. It was a decision made slowly, with real doubt sitting alongside it the entire time, right up until the moment I finally put my name down and accepted what Groves was asking of me.